All right, so Formula One, right. Always something going on, never dull moment, and you, my friend, have a knack for finding the juiciest bits. This time, it's a bit of a head-scratcher coming straight out of Melbourne. A rule change, seemingly out of the blue, that could really shake things up at the front of the grid. Welcome to our deep dive into flexing rear wings.
Yeah, you're spot on. It's a fascinating development. The reports are said they all seem to be pointing in the same direction. The FIA is cracking down on how much they'll use a lot sooner than we thought we could do a standard
So what was it about the Australian Grand Prix specifically that set off alarm bells for the FIA? Something just to follow.
Well, it's attention during the free practice. Those F1
Yes, the final reveal of this show
onboard
is for the world champion,
to really scrutinize
McLaren team. Let's welcome on stage Zach Brown, probably.
the stewards, they're the guys coming over the data. They must have seen some rear wings flex.
So get ready then. The MCL.
One F1 blog went as far as singling out McLaren, highlighting their aero advantage and that rear wing in particular. They even mentioned it being called a MINI-DRS.
I wonder what the
It sounds like McLaren was getting extra speed without actually using the DRS system.
Yeah, it's a clever way to put it, that MINI-DRS, DRS, the drag reduction. It opens a flap in the rear wing to reduce drag and give drivers more speed. What McLaren seemed to have done was engineer their rear wing to flex at high speeds, effectively getting a similar drag reduction without actually press. Yeah, exactly. And it was particularly noticeable at those super fast tracks last year. It seems like they might have brought that same design philosophy into this season, and it could be part of the reason why they're making
So the FIA decided it was time to revisit. Let's get into the specifics of these strict regulations. What exactly are they?
Well, after all the observations they made in Australia, the FIA announced this immediate change to how they test rear wing flexibility. It kicks in right away at the Chinese Grand Prix. One of the F1 blogs did a great job breaking it down.
It's Einstein, like this in Formula One, even the
Oh, absolutely. And the new regulation, as those blogs report, tightens that allowance dramatically. Now it's just half a millimeter, 0.5 millimeters, with a tiny margin of error, just 0.25 millimeters, just for this first weekend.
Wow, so a much stricter test.
Exactly. The FIA even put out a statement, and one of the articles quoted it directly. They said they found reasons to harden the test after looking at images of those rear wings flexing and conducting those static tests in the garages.
So the big question now is, what does this mean for the pecking order? Who are the winners and losers from this sudden rule change?
Well, one of the F1 blogs we looked at pointed out something pretty interesting. They said Red Bull is conforming, which essentially means they're fine with this change. And knowing that McLaren beat them in Melbourne, it makes you wonder, right? Did Red Bull see that flexing around as a part of McLaren's speed? And maybe they even welcomed this rule change.
Oh, that's a good point. And it's not just that they're conformed, right? The fact that the FIA is implementing this so quickly, bumping it up ahead of Spain, that seems to add more weight to that theory.
Yeah.
But what about McLaren? I mean, they're the ones everyone is talking about. Do these F1 blogs think this stricter regulation is going to hurt their performance?
That's the big unknown right now, and the F1 blogs certainly seem to think it could. They directly ask whether this will compromise McLaren's dominance, especially because their aerodynamic efficiency, which seems to be largely tied to their rear wing design, has been such a crucial part of their early success.
So it's a real wait-and-see situation for McLaren.
Absolutely. And here's another wrinkle that the blogs pointed out. The FIA did say all the cars were legal in Australia, but they didn't say if that was based on the old rules or these new, much stricter ones. We know McLaren's MINI-DRS design from late last year, the one that relied on that flexible rear wing. It was eventually banned. It seems like maybe the initial 2025 rules might have allowed for something similar, at least up until Spain, but now this rule change is shutting that down a lot sooner.
Got it. So one of the blogs even went deep into the technical weeds, mentioning Article 3.15.17, the regulations. What's the key detail they're changing in that article?
Yeah, they really got into the nitty-gritty there. Article 3.15.1 it all boils down to the slot gap. which is basically the space between the different elements of the rear wing and the mechanism that opens it. That gap is super important for controlling airflow, generating downforce, and reducing drag.
And how are they changing that slot gap?
The new limit is 0.5 millimeters under a 750 Newton load. And it's important to note that this test is done with the car stationary. That's a big difference from the 2 millimeters they allowed in Australia. Just to put that 750 Newton load into perspective, it's basically the force exerted by a 75 kilogram weight under gravity. So it's a significant amount of force, and they're demanding much less flex now. It just goes to show how closely they scrutinize these regulations and how even seemingly minor changes can have a huge impact on aerodynamics.
So big implications for McLaren and Red Bull. But what about the rest of the grid? Could this rule change have a wider impact?
Oh, absolutely. One of the F1 blogs made a really interesting point about that. They suggested this change could not only close the gap between McLaren and Red Bull, but it might even give a boost to teams like Ferrari, who haven't had the best start to the season, to say the least.
Makes sense. Ferrari haven't looked too happy so far.
Yeah, not really. And remember, aerodynamic efficiency, it's crucial for every team on the grid. So any changes to these fundamental rules, it can have a ripple effect up and down the field, impacting those midfield teams just as much as the front runners.
Okay, so looking ahead, where do we think we'll really see the true impact of this new regulation?
Well, those F1 blogs pointed to the upcoming races, China, then Suzuka, and then Sakir. They call these traditional circuits because they have more conventional track layouts and a mix of different corners and speeds compared to, say, Albert Park in Melbourne, which is a bit more unique. So the idea is that these upcoming races will give us a much clearer picture of the true pecking order now that this rear wing rule has been tightened up.
Makes sense. Australia might have been a bit of an anomaly, a bit of a distorted view, and now these next races should reveal the real performance differences between the teams.
Exactly.
So to sum it all up, what's the key takeaway from this whole rear wing saga?
The big takeaway, and all those F1 blogs were very clear on this, is that the FIA has, quite unexpectedly and with immediate effect, tightened up the rules on rear wing flexibility in Formula One. This new rule starts at the Chinese Grand Prix. It's a direct response to what they saw in Australia, and it drastically reduces how much those rear wings can flex under load.
And what are the likely consequences, especially in the short term?
Well, it could mean that McLaren's apparent aerodynamic advantage, the one that's been driving their strong start to the season, might be diminished. On the flip side, teams like Red Bull, who seem pretty comfortable with the change, might actually benefit. So these next few races are going to be really crucial. They'll show us the true impact of this rule change on the competitive landscape. It's a developing story we'll be watching very closely.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Just how much these tiny details, these technical nuances, can influence performance in Formula One. It makes you wonder what other little loopholes, what other tiny bits of the regulations the teams are exploiting to gain an edge. I'm sure McLaren's engineers are already hard at work trying to figure out new and clever ways to regain any performance they might have lost. It's a never-ending game of cat and mouse, really. Thanks for walking us through all this. It's been really enlightening.
You got it. It just goes to show that in Formula One, things can change in a heartbeat.
And for all of you joining us for this deep dive into the world of F1, be sure to check out the F1 Blogs YouTube channel. They've got loads more analysis and discussions on all the latest developments in Formula One. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of their content.
Yeah, definitely worth a watch. They offer a great perspective on the sport.
Until next time, keep those engines revving.
See you then.